On the day his masterpiece was finished, the architect gathered every drawing he had made over 11 years and burned them in the courtyard of the palace he had just completed. He did it in front of witnesses, calmly. He fed 11 years of work into the fire, one sheet at a time, and watched until there was nothing left but ash. Then he handed over the keys, bowed, and left. He never built anything again. What no one in that courtyard understood, what no one would understand for 300 years, was that the drawings he burned were the only thing that could ever reveal what the palace actually was. Because Mateo de Herrera had not just built a palace, he had hidden something inside it, something the people living there would never see, because it could only be read from the plans he had just turned to ash. The palace stands in southern Spain, in the hills of Andalusia, built in the early 1500s. Herrera was, by every account, a genius. But his palace was strange in ways people could feel and never explain. Corridors curved where a straight hallway would have been simpler. Windows sat at odd heights. One long passage bent gently around nothing at all, for no reason anyone could see, and ended, always, facing the same small room at the center of the building. Visitors sensed the strangeness. They just couldn't read it, because you cannot read it from inside. Herrera had spent 11 years arranging the entire palace, every room, every angle, every path of light, into a single pattern. A pattern visible only from above, only from the complete plans, all at once. The palace was a message, and the people who lived in it walked through the middle of that message every day, unable to see it. For 3 centuries, no one knew this. The palace was simply an unusually beautiful, slightly strange building. Then modern researchers mapped it and found that the irregularities were not random. Here is one they still point to. That long curving corridor, the one that bends around nothing. When you trace it from above, it forms part of a perfect arc, and every other odd angle in the palace bends toward completing that same shape. The building is curving toward something, deliberately, at a scale no one standing inside could ever perceive. Something is encoded in the shape of the palace itself, and it centers on that one small room at its heart. But without Herrera's complete plans, the ones he burned, no one has ever reconstructed the full pattern. We can see it is there. We cannot read what it says, which raises the question that has haunted everyone who has learned this story. What was so private or so precious that a man would encode it into an entire palace, hide it at a scale only he could see, and then burn the only key that could reveal it? Who was the message for? One man came closer to that answer than anyone else ever has. His name was Lucas Vela, a young apprentice who studied under Herrera in the architect's final years. And Vela spent the rest of his life convinced he knew exactly what his master had hidden and who it was meant for. He was never able to prove it. But what he pieced together from years at Herrera's side and one strange conversation near the end is the closest anyone has ever come to reading the message in the walls. It begins with a question Vela once asked his master, a simple question about why Herrera had never married, never had children, never left anything of himself behind. And the answer Herrera gave made no sense at all, until Vela finally understood what the palace really was. The question was simple. Herrera's answer was not. When Vela asked why his master had left nothing of himself behind, Herrera said, "You are wrong. I left behind exactly one thing, and I made certain no one would ever be able to take it apart." At the time, Vela thought he meant the palace itself. Later, he became convinced Herrera meant something inside it. Vela knew the palace well, and over years of study, he noticed what modern researchers would only rediscover centuries later, that its irregularities formed a pattern, and that the pattern seemed to center on one specific room. The room was small, plain, and located at the exact heart of the building, the point toward which every strange angle and curving corridor seemed to orient. It had no obvious purpose. It was too small to be a bedroom, too plain to be a receiving hall. It was simply a small, quiet room at the center of everything. Herrera, Vela learned, had spent more time on that single room than on any other part of the palace. He had built it first, before anything else, and arranged the entire rest of the structure around it. Vela became convinced that whatever Herrera had encoded into the palace, it pointed inward, toward that one small room. That the entire enormous building was, in effect, an arrow, a monument aimed at something, or someone, meant to occupy that quiet space at its heart. But here Vela's account stops being certain and becomes something more human. He wrote that he once asked Herrera who the central room was for, and that Herrera, normally so precise, so controlled, went quiet for a long time, and then said only, "For someone who never came." He would not explain. He never spoke of it again. And Vela was left to spend the rest of his life wondering whether his master had built an entire palace, encoded a message across 11 years of work, then burned the key as a monument to a person who was supposed to live at its heart and never did. A love that failed. A child who was lost. A promise that was broken. Vela did not know. Herrera took the answer with him. But Vela believed to the end of his life that the palace was not a puzzle meant to be solved. It was a message meant to be sent to one specific person, and that when that person never came, Herrera did the only thing that made sense to him. He sealed the message inside the walls, burned the key, and walked away, leaving behind a building that would say what he could not, forever, to someone who would never read it. We will never know if Vela was right. The palace still stands in Andalusia. The strange angles are still there. The small room at its heart is still there, plain, quiet, oriented toward by every corridor in the building, its purpose still unexplained. Researchers still map the patterns, still find pieces of something encoded in the design, still cannot read the whole. The one man who could have told us burned the answer in a courtyard 500 years ago and gave only 6 words about it to one apprentice near the end of his life, for someone who never came. So, I will leave you with the question Vela never answered, the one that kept him wondering until he died. What would you build if you could say something to a person who would never hear it? And would you hide it where no one could read it? Or make certain somehow that one day someone would? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. Some people write a letter they never send. Mateo de Herrera built one, the size of a palace, and burned the only translation, so that his message would stand for centuries, perfectly preserved and perfectly unreadable. If you want to know about the palace where every clock was removed by royal order, every clock in every room carried out and never allowed to return, that story is coming next. Subscribe, and I will see you there.